and co-founder of DLA Ignite. With me is Ed Fowler.
Hi, folks.
And
Ed Fowler.
you can come on, Ed, say hello.
Hello.
And so we set up this podcast to talk about AI. What we're trying to do with it is raise people's awareness, educate. We're not selling anything. This is just really a way of trying to share our experience so that you can learn as well. I think it's all of us it's important that all of us learn something about AI and understand it, because there's lots of hype. There's lots of, wouldn't say,
and doubt.
I wouldn't say there's a lot of misinformation about what it will and what it won't do. The number one question that we get, and please ask questions, leave comments in the chat, and that we'd love to hear any questions that you have. The number one question that I get from direct mail, email perspective is legislation.
Absolutely.
Are we going to have any? If we do, what's it going to look like? Where's it going to come from? So we know that there's been meetings in the US. They've had meetings with Kamala Harris has had meetings in the White House. Then Joe Biden was going to pick it up. In the UK, there's been talk about there was no legislation, and then I heard on the news today there is going to be AI legislation, and then the Europeans are going to do it because the UK is no longer in Europe, if you haven't noticed. The Europeans are going to do something, and they're going to do something to GDPR, which, if you don't know what GDPR is, it's legislation that was created around data privacy, and they brought a whole load of things together into one piece of legislation. So, Ed,
there's
AI legislation. Will we or won't we?
You need some, because there are basic things you need to do with an AI. Because an AI is essentially a statistical engine in the main, you need to know what it's basing on. So there's three things: is you've got to be able to test for bias, you've got to test for unfairness, and you've got to do something called AI explainability. So explainability says is, hello, Mr. Machine, I've interacted with you, you've created some information, and you may have made a decision. Where did you get that from? So there's going to be some legislation about that. One is, look, your core data, what you're making this on, what is it? What is your data set?
So in a way, it's a bit like having a supply chain of like food. You need to know where
you've got to have a certain provenance to your data.
Yes, so you've got to have. I know that I've got that answer from that bit of data, and that's come from somewhere.
And then the second thing you're going to get is some form of effectively transactional integrity. If you've got a transaction, there's an AI in the middle of it. What was the data you gave it that it made the decision on, and what was this decision again? If I ran this a couple of times, would it always give me the same decision, or is it just a statistical variance? And what does that mean? Because if you're doing, say, an AI in medical fields or legal fields or contractual stuff, you're going to need that. And I think that's like a global minimum: is what data are you using from? What's your supply chain of data? What's the explainability or traceability of this transaction? And can I guarantee this transaction is safe? I've got transactional integrity. And then what we're seeing at the moment is theatre. And this is driven not really by regulation, not driven by GDPR, because GDPR has important use case in this one. If I have a conversation with an AI, and then 6 months later I go, I want my data out, GDPR says I have the right to take my data out of this data set. Now, the challenge with an AI like this is, say I describe myself as, hi, I'm Ed, ABC. And the AI responds, great, I'm AI 123. And I come along and go, right, remove Ed, ABC from your AI data set. Everybody goes, great. But that statistical inference to AI 123 has been made. So there is a possibility, depending on the scale of it, large or small, that if somebody in the future typed in AI 123, they might get some data back that would reflect Ed ABC. Now that's very hard to get out, and it sounds on the surface as some quite difficult, impossible sort of conundrum to get into, because that's kind of a fundamental piece of data you're going to have to try and get out.
So just for unless just so people know, there's some, as part of GDPR, the European legislation, which at the time the UK was part of Europe, there was a part of it called the right to remain forgotten. It's quite a funny story how it came about, which I don't have detail to go into. But you have the ability to say, I want this removed from from search engines and platforms. And if you say that, there's legislation in place to say that that actually has to take place.
It has. And I think sounds on the surface great. There are vanishingly few large organizations which have the tools to comply with this right now.
Yes.
So like most of them simply can't. So you're going to see some big ban hammers coming around the place. Italy, for example, banned ChatGPT for a while.
And that was mainly a GDPR.
But the thing we're seeing now is this sort of politicized regulation is more on the theater side of stuff. So you've got big tech meeting up with the White House, heavily interacting with the EU. You see some big threats coming out. OpenAI CEO today goes, if the EU gets its regulation too heavy, I'm leaving the EU. No, he's not. It's his second largest market. Is he hell? What he's trying to do is to, and you'll see other things that are coming out. AI is incredibly dangerous. AI could end humanity type headlines come out. They are all trying to push regulators into acting with a very heavy hand.
So this is people that have a vested interest to, in effect, kill off AI because they don't.
No, not to kill off at all.
Right.
To protect the AIs they have.
Or to basically catch up.
No, not. It's to protect OpenAI and Google.
Right.
Because neither of them are really that interested in AI. OpenAI says it is, but it's now owned by Microsoft by a huge chunk. And Microsoft's not really interested in AI because it partially kills their money spinner, which is Office and data. And Google's not really interested in AI because generative AI murders paid search. So there's that. What they're worried about is open source AI. Open source AI, since Facebook effectively released its models into the wild and said, yeah, they're open source, is explosively becoming better. It's already neither now on the cusp of or even potentially better than ChatGPT-4, which is the leading model. These things are small, nimble, and light. And crucially, you can train them for about $100 and they will fit on a large USB stick. Now, it's acknowledged by Google and several others, there is no moat. These large protected, these large models like Google have and ChatGPT have aren't necessarily A, the best way forward, or B, particularly unique. They were just first. So what they're trying to do is to push regulation into a licensing model. They have bitched generative AI as some incredibly dangerous stuff we must regulate heavily. And the EU, predictably, has responded. The latest proposal that came out as a discussion point for the EU Parliament effectively sets up an EU-wide AI licensing authority, which you must submit your AI to at any scale, doesn't say developer or anything, open source or anything, for a comprehensive testing and licensing model. They're basically going to treat this like it's a pharmaceutical.
Right. No. Like a drug.
Like a drug.
Yeah.
Now, that's big, heavy, and slow, and is designed to kill off progress. Because what's actually Google and AI and OpenAI worried about is the fact that they have no real product. Anybody can set these bloody things up. They're very easy to use. They're very quick and simple. I've got one training at the moment, basically just looking at the works of Shakespeare. I've got another one training at the moment, looking at my saved games from a game that I've been playing for decades to try and see if it can play like me. I would have to license both of those. Now, I am playing another game that has an AI in its character generation journey. It creates your images based on how you type a description in. It will set up your capabilities. That would have to be licensed. All of those use cases are semi-trivial. Yet the way the EU is setting it up is they were licensed because the AIs that can provide that apparently are incredibly dangerous. Let's step back. AI is not incredibly dangerous in its current form. This is never going to be some world-ending super intelligence. It isn't intelligent. It isn't aware. It doesn't have any emotions. It is a better screwdriver. I don't have to license a screwdriver at the moment. I can make my own. Yet what they want to do, because ChatGPT or rather OpenAI and Google have spent quite a lot of money on this, they want to pretend that this is something else. And it simply isn't. It is it is a stochastic parrot. It's a parrot. Doesn't understand what you're telling it. Just repeats words.
I sometimes think that actually that's derogatory to parrots.
I think some of these things are bloody.
Because I think sometimes parrots are.
What it is very good at predicting and articulating certain things, and there are some interesting developments on that model. So at the moment, you go by token length. So tokens is the number of tokens it can remember a conversation and coherently predict against. Currently, it's about 30,000. for a good model, and that's like about a novella size stuff. You could theoretically, if you wanted really boring, middle of the road, statistically safe novella produced, get ChatGPT to produce one. Now there's some ways to improve the efficiency of this and get it up to about 1 million tokens, which is broadly the same depth of intimacy as you would have with your spouse.
Right.
It would remember. So, but it's not going to create anything. It's going to be statistically very middle of the road. So what we're banging on about is this thing is going to be a scam. You're going to see these things being very dangerous. You're going to see these things being this. And they keep on, I've started for America, heard a lot of things. It passes exams, like the bar exam. It can pass a Turing test. It can pass a Turing test if you only ask it really boring things, because they've sanitized most of the databases. So ask ChatGPT how to make a pipe bomb. It can't answer it. And no current AI will, because they're all sanitized. There are questions that only a human being can answer because they are outside a statistical norm. With that in mind, regulation starts taking on a very different light. This is a toolkit. It's incredibly productive and it has some incredible use cases, particularly translation, interpolation, extrapolation. Really great. Those are incredibly powerful, but yet they threaten some vested interests that have got away with charging a lot of money for pretty boring work. They are pushing the narrative that this is dangerous, therefore it requires very heavy regulation. And that very heavy regulation model, if they do go treating it like a drug, will probably lead to a significant underground trade in AIs, rather like you get with drugs. Because that works.
I didn't say that, Ed. Yeah. I have no idea.
Yeah, at the moment I believe there's a fair amount of underground trade.
Allegedly, Ed. Yeah.
In illegal substances. And what's going to happen is you're going to get this big regulatory environment that says you can't progress, you can't do anything, that just protects effectively large tech organizations. Organizations who wish to leverage this in a more free-form or democratic way are going to find barriers in their pipe. And this is purely a protective world. It's I'm not a natural libertarian, but in this case, regulation has to go very light touch. It needs to focus on, where did you get your data from? If you're making a decision, can we at least check that your data isn't biased to heck? B, can we check that I can get my data out in a meaningful way? I know I can't get it out completely, but can I get most of my data out of it in some way? Yeah, great. Thirdly, if there's an important decision, can I be told in advance there's an AI in this loop? And secondly, if there is, can you give me some transactional explainability? Those are really quite light touch things. I think that's pretty much as far as it is. So if you look at the example of GDPR's right to be forgotten was driven by a series of German and French political and criminal scandals. In Germany, the German stuff has always been that a criminal could just erase their track record, no matter what they've done, including
there was one famous one in the UK as well.
Yeah, and they wanted to do this. Now, if you actually peel back the original Data Protection Act before GDPR, it had you can only hold data as a data controller for as long as you find this useful. And therefore, that was actually your right to be forgotten. It was tied in with data retention. Now we have this big, primarily driven by French and German political interests who find it useful to be able to remove data from public things where they've been convicted, say, of corruption or sexual impropriety. That isn't a particularly good example of legislation. It's very heavy, it's very clunky. Almost nobody fully complies with it, and it just gives a license to sue for fairly rich and powerful vested interests. If we can avoid that, AI is a very useful tool for nearly every use case. And one of the most fascinating use cases that's coming out was its detection rate of strange and odd diseases.
Yes.
Normally this is remarkably good. You type in a bunch of symptoms, and it can give you things that human doctors would simply just have forgotten because they haven't seen it often enough. They don't know this collection of symptoms that you're describing comes up. There's another thing is that AI is hugely good at talking to people who feel guilt or are confused. AI therapists appear to work extremely well. AI chat sort of service things, sort of call center that have vastly higher customer satisfaction rates than human ones do because they don't get bored with the conversation. They haven't had a bad Tuesday. They're not getting shouted at. Their performance is pretty standard and it's good. Those are hugely powerful things. Their AIs are really good at stitching legacy systems together with new ones.
So that well, I think I've got a funny story. Well, I think it's funny anyway. So I don't know if you saw the story about the guy who's actually developed some glasses to wear on a date.
That look up somebody.
And basically what it does is that if you get asked a question, it will look up an answer on ChatGPT that you can then read through the glasses. The problem is it takes 6 seconds.
Yeah, well, some people like to think they take this comprised stuff.
So you're going to go, that's an interesting question.
And then give a really boring statistic.
And then you have a really boring answer that and then you read it off.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. And I mean, this has got some stalker things as well you can attach to it. Who is this person I'm looking at? But if we look at, shall we say, the upsides of this are hugely powerful. It is genuinely a better screwdriver. But that's all it is. So I think regulation has to be appropriate, it has to be practical, and it has to be effectively something that doesn't act as a barrier to useful progress, yet impedes and explains transactions you may not wish to. I would also very strongly put the benefit, or rather put the weight of compliance, not on the providers. I would put it on the users. Make it like a caveat emptor. If you're putting AI into your customer service things, you better trust it, haven't you? So you can't be starting to point fingers at people later on and go, oh my God, this was awful. It called that person a really rude name. What did I do? I'm innocent. Well, you put it in. So I think this brings up some sort of interesting concepts. Given that AI is really good at translation, an awful lot of the work of a traditional software architect kind of going to be threatened. We've got a lot of these software architects around the place. What they should be looking at is something called ethics architecture, which is how do you translate either government regulation or best practice and your organization's ethical stance into something that system does. And I think if you get some really complex regulation that comes down from law, that's going to slow the actual practical flow from this is regulation, this is what my company stands for or organization, this is how that reflects in system behavior.
Because if we go back to the first interview with you, you talked about a CEO, a chief ethics officer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you still advocating that?
I think this is important anyway. I think as data becomes more prevalent in every business, I mean, if you look at this sort of utopian future, every business is data driven. You have to have potentially more than a chief data officer. You have to have the chief ethics officer who the data officer reports into. Ideally, you could say that's your CEO, but probably not. But one of the functions that ethics officer has to have is control of their ethics architecture. Now, I didn't say ethical architecture. This practice doesn't really matter what the ethics are. It is the process of translating ethical statements and law into actionable policy that then you can put into system tests that then you can effectively evolve and mature into system behaviors. So the idea being is you move from a post facto, here's the regulation, what did the system do type model, to a ethics by design, ethics as code type model. Because if this translation goes right, you have ethics as code. This is your sort of French pharmaceuticals standard ethical models that have to be translatable as system behaviors. And that's going to be a fascinating area for a lot of people to get involved with. Creating effectively an ethics architecture model that you can then input your ethics into is going to be brilliant. Now, you could get, frankly, a tailored AI to do that could help you create some ethical stances, could then check through all of your company policies to make sure that those ethical stances are reflected in that company policy and have an actionable point. They're not just woolly. And then you can you can translate a policy into a system test, create effectively Gherkin script from it. Once you've got Gherkin script, you can start hanging software libraries off the back of that. Once you've got software libraries that have got ethics in them, that is your ethics as code. You just call them during system behaviors. And I think there's going to be a wave of innovation that's going to drive these type of things. Now, if you were a regulator, a smart regulator, I wouldn't be talking about hammering the usage. I would be getting involved with the open source communities and standards communities that are going to set those. And that is smart regulation. You set standards, you put the onus of complying with that standard on the user. You effectively free it all up with open source to say, Does your model take advantage of these standards? Well, fill your boots. And that means that you have light touch, you're pro innovation, you're going to be pro people who are using it. And if something does go wrong, the person who's at fault is the person that put the AI in, because caveat emptor. Now, I know that's a very Anglo-Saxon way of looking at sort of regulation. It's a very sort of thing, but I think that means that you don't get in the way of progress, because the use cases are just frothing at the moment. I was watching a fascinating video just before we came on of a tool that creates immersive environments inside games in real time. And it doesn't effectively, it's not procedural. They're created based on your drivers, and they're narratively linked. They're not just, here's a world and here's all the potential outcomes inside this parameter set. This is stuff that genuinely tries to predict what you want to do. And that's quite fascinating. And it's going to lead to new forms of entertainment, new forms of true omni-channel entertainment as well. A regulation has to come up in those two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, just like the IT, you know, when IT and computers first started, you know, the German word for the silicon chip or whatever it was, the job killer.
Yeah.
And IT and the silicon chip and computers have generated more jobs. You know, I've made a career out of working in
I have a suspicion, I read somewhere that the IT has generated nearly 500 million jobs.
Yeah. And you know, the same with AI. It's just that the jobs, we don't know what they are. It's, you know, we have a client which is a Cyberhawk, which is a drones company.
Yeah.
Now, you know, drone controller was not a job 5 years ago.
Drone pilot, yeah, exactly. And this is going to be very much so. And I think from one of our previous conversations, we talked about what will be the differential of the jobs of future rather than the jobs today. They're going to be, the jobs of the future are going to be less process centric. They're going to be more creativity, because you'll have an AI companion or co-pilot, whatever, that kind of handles the process. It's going to help you execute. You're going to be focused on making real decisions and coming up with innovation, because the AI can't really do innovation. It just stitches stuff. It can synthesize quite well.
But I saw a tweet this week, which was, it said, I hadn't realized with the introduction of AI is that we'll all be flipping burgers for minimum wage, while AI is basically writing poems and producing art.
And I think this is one of the there's a lot of people panicking about it, because if you've seen any AI poems, they ain't great. They're really not great yet. Sure, they might get better, but also then there may be some revaluing of some careers.
So I just need to. I just want to, before we go, I just want to say thank you to Chuck for the DM he sent, and everybody else who's sent the various comments and stuff to us. I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, folks.
And thanks, Ed, again for a fascinating. I didn't think that you'd better talk about it for 20 minutes.
Probably.
And then at 12 minutes, I looked up. I thought, oh, you're right. You have actually got 40 minutes worth of conversation.
And that's this week. Anyway, great, folks. Fantastic.
See everybody soon. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ed, for sharing this.